Good evening. I'd like to thank the Campus Crusade for Christ student movement here at Saddleback College, as well as Free Thinkers for sponsoring the debate tonight, as well as Jim for his willingness to participate. In tonight's debate, I'm going to defend two contentions. But first, here are three assumptions that I grant. Assumption number one, you do not have to believe in God to be moral. There are plenty of people who believe in God and have acted immorally, and plenty of atheists who have lived morally respectable lives. So again, atheists can be moral. Second, you do not have to believe in God to know morality. People of different religions or no religion can know right from wrong, even if they don't believe in God. And third, you can believe in God and do bad things, and even do them in the name of God. Now, since I grant those tonight, and I'm sure I have common ground with Jim on them, there'd be little point in debating them tonight. So let's focus on the topic we agreed to debate, which is God the best explanation for moral values? Now, Paul Kurtz, a leading secular humanist, stated this question very well. He said the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their ontological foundation, if they really exist. If they are neither derived from God, nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral or illusions? In other words, he's saying, do we have a transcendent source for morality? If so, we can say moral values are real. If not, on what basis can we say they even exist? Now, recently I came across a story that as a teacher and as a father, especially of a daughter, broke my heart. Maybe some of you recall it. Last October at Richmond High School in California here, one night during a homecoming dance, 20 people gathered outside while for 2 hours a 15-year-old girl was brutally beaten and raped. They found her underneath a park bench at midnight. Now, I think we can all agree that what happened to this girl was an egregious, horrendous evil. In fact, if you don't think that is evil, then as philosopher William Lane Craig said, you don't need an argument, you need therapy. And my sister, who's here tonight, is a therapist. I'd be glad to give you a referral. Now, what does it mean to say that that gang rape, is objectively morally wrong? What we mean when we say that is that it is wrong independently of whether anybody believes it to be so or not. So even if the people who carried that rape out thought it was okay, or they thought it was fun, or they didn't get caught, that act in itself would be objectively wrong. In fact, saying gang rape is evil is just as much an objective feature of the world as saying that 2 + 2 = 4, or LeBron James, a great basketball player, is 6'8". Now, in contrast, when I say chocolate peanut butter ice cream is delicious, I've definitely said something that is true. But I haven't said something about the ice cream. I've said something about my preferences. So when I say chocolate peanut butter ice cream is delicious, it's true because it reflects the subject, which is me, rather than the object, the ice cream. Now, it seems that Jim agrees with this distinction between objective and subjective truth. For example, in a speech before the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Jim said, quote, "Our history, our political beliefs, and even Christianity itself is being hijacked to reflect Puritan views that were often narrow-minded, racist, misogynistic, and intolerant. We all, especially teachers, have a duty to communicate the truth to our young people." Now notice what he says. He says all of us have this duty, whether we agree with him or not. So he's saying there's moral obligations that are impending upon all of us, even if we disagree with him. Now, if he doesn't think these are objective moral values, when he says we shouldn't be narrow-minded or intolerant or racist, he's simply spouting his subjective preferences, basically like choosing an ice cream flavor. So it seems that both Jim and I agree that there are objective moral values. The question before us tonight is, what is the best explanation for these moral values? Now, as I said earlier, I'm going to defend two contentions. First contention, if God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. Second, if God does exist, we do have a solid foundation for moral values. Now, to do this, I'm going to point to 3 criteria that any adequate moral system must be able to account for. If it cannot account for these 3 criteria, it'll be an inadequate moral system. So first, any adequate moral system must have a transcendent standard beyond human nature. Now, the Nurnberg Trials were a series of trials between 1945 and 1949 in Nuremberg, in which Nazi leaders were put on trial for crimes against humanity. Now, one of the most interesting cases, 24 were on trial, and the defense of the Nazis was so compelling that some of the prosecution wondered, how can we possibly condemn them for their actions? Now, you're probably thinking, what on earth could be said in defense of the Nazi crimes? Well, legal expert Dr. John Warwick Montgomery explains in his book, Law Above Law. He says the most telling defense offered by the accused was that they had simply followed orders or made decisions within the framework of their own legal system, in complete consistency with it, and that they therefore could not rightly be condemned because they deviated from the alien value system of their conquerors. The trial came to a halt. It stopped, and people wondered, how can we condemn them because of this defense? Well, the Chief Counsel of the United States at the time, Robert Jackson, had a solution. He called it the law above the law. He said if there is a law above and beyond human nature, then we have the right to judge different cultures, such as the Nazis, as being wrong. In fact, this law above the law applies to both the winners and the losers of the war. Now the question is, where can such a law above the law come from? Well, it doesn't seem that it could come from some evolutionary natural process. I mean, atoms don't have ethics. Molecules don't have morality. But if God exists, we have a transcendent source. His very nature and his existence is the law above the law. Now, Hitler thought he was doing what was right. We think he did what was wrong. Now, unless there's a law above the law and a transcendent standard of morality, by what basis can we judge that he's wrong? It's simply our opinion against his. I think Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, is right. If there is no God, all is permissible. If there is no God, all is permissible. Now, Jim might tell you some stories about some bad things that have been done in the name of religion. And I already said I agree that bad things have been done by religious people, or at least people who claim to be religious. Like you, I'm outraged by many of them. But the reason we can be outraged is because there is a transcendent objective standard that was violated. In fact, if just one thing is objectively wrong, say the witch hunts, for example, if one thing is objectively wrong, then we have an objective moral standard. And if there's an objective moral standard, there must be a God. Now, before Jim can complain or talk about religion misbehavior, he must offer a transcendent standard for morality apart from God. Otherwise, he's simply spouting his subjective preferences. Basically, I like chocolate better. Second, any adequate moral system must account for free will. Morality, by its very nature, presumes free will. If your teacher says you shouldn't cheat on your exam, that implies you can or you cannot cheat on your exam. In fact, one of the definitions for moral at dictionary.com is capable of conforming to the right rules of conduct. So morality presumes that we have free will. Now, this poses a problem for any moral system without God. Where does free will come from? In 1924, the year before the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow was called in by the ACLU to defend two affluent University of Chicago students who were being trained in the philosophy of Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche said God does not exist, and as a result, morality is a complete fabrication. He said we're left with might makes right in the absence of God. And the enlightened can declare themselves free from morality and simply live as they choose. Now, two students named Leopold and Loeb decided to put that philosophy into practice. They went out and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks just for the thrill of it. But the defense that Clarence Darrow gave is interesting. Listen to what he said. He said, is Dickie Loeb to blame because of the infinite forces that were at work producing him ages before he was born? Is he to blame because his machine is imperfect? In other words, he said, because he assumed evolution is true, and the way they behaved was the result of prior physical factors, they couldn't have any free will, and as a result, we couldn't condemn them for their actions. Now, I think he's right. If God does not exist, we don't have free will. In fact, Cornell University professor William Provine, an outspoken atheist, said, without God, there is no free will. Now, why would that be the case? If God does not exist, all that is real is matter and energy. which conforms to the laws of nature, the laws of physics. And so a human being is solely a physical machine, acted upon by forces in the environment or chemicals in the brain. Thus, there would be no such thing as free will. Now, Michael Shermer, well-known skeptic and atheist, wrote in his book, The Science of Good and Evil, "Abandon free will in favor of determinism, and moral culpability flies out the courtroom window." In other words, if there's no free will, there can't be moral praise or moral blame. Yet that's exactly what follows from any moral system without God. Third, any adequate moral system must account for what makes humans special. Philosopher William Lane Craig put it well. He said, if there is no God, what is so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust, lost somewhere in the heart of a hostile and mindless universe, and are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. I think he's right. If there is no God, the exact same blind, purposeless evolutionary process that created human beings has created everything else in nature. So what possibly makes us significant? Now, it seems that Jim actually agrees with this point. In his 2007 AP European notes, which are part of the public record, Jim said, look, as the sun is a star, there are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand in all of the beaches of the world combined. We are not just insignificant. No, we are beyond comprehension insignificant. We can't even conceive of how insignificant we are. So next time it's Valentine's Day, and your honey looks at you with longing in her eyes, expecting a gift, simply say, sorry, honey, you're just too insignificant. Now, I don't think Jim actually believes this. Of course not. I met his lovely wife and family before. But the problem remains. If there is no God, what makes humans significant? In fact, think about the tragedy that recently happened in Haiti. I know all of us in here, whether Christian or Buddhist or secular humanist, whatever, gave of our time and shed tears over what happened. Yet why should we care about that if humans don't have special value and intrinsic dignity? New atheist Sam Harris in his book, The End of Faith, says, the child born without limbs, the sightless fly, the vanished species, these are nothing less than Mother Nature caught in the act of throwing her clay. So again, my two contentions tonight. If God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. But if God does exist, we do have a solid foundation for moral values. In fact, J.L. Mackie, probably the most influential atheist of the 20th century from Oxford University, he said this, if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of God. Now, how does this work? We saw that morality requires a transcendent standard. God's own character is that standard as expressed in his commands. Second, any adequate moral system must account for free will. God is a spirit and is not coerced by anything external or internal. Human beings made in his image have free will and the ability of free choice. And third, human value. God's own character is the locus of the good. And human beings, as made in his image, also have value. So again, my two contentions for tonight. If God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. But if God does exist, we do have a solid foundation for moral values. Now tonight, Jim must respond to my two contentions and offer an explanation that is more reasonable than God for moral values. Now at this point, I won't speculate as to what his explanation might be. I won't shoot down straw men. Maybe he'll point to evolution. Maybe he'll put to some social contract there. I have no idea. I'll wait till he presents a better explanation, then I'll respond to it in my first rebuttal. In the meantime, I think we should take his words to heart. Jim said this in his AP European class, I'm interested in the facts. I'm interested in that which can be reasonably believed to be true because it is based in fact and in reason. You're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. Well said. So is God the best explanation for moral values? Until and unless Jim can offer a more reasonable justification for moral values, then the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Dr. Jim Corbett, 15-minute opening remarks.
Well, I come before you after this, Xbox Halo presentation. No mic. Did I turn on mine? I think that I was. There we go. There we go? Yeah. I come before you after this theological Xbox presentation as a kind of Space Invaders Atari version. All you got out of me is some talk. And Sean's presentation was just fabulous. But to state the obvious, all people at all times have regularly and often violently disagreed about the nature of God and God's word and morality. My opponent argues that even if we can't agree about the nature of God, we should agree that God, whatever his nature, is necessary for us to be moral. Now, normally you would defer to another's faith. It's polite. But I can't very well defer to his point of view here. In truth, I doubt he's correct. And that's the key to pretty much everything I have to say tonight. Doubt. I know more than most. It's dangerous to even challenge Sean's views with rational questions. In truth, mankind will never agree with Sean. Not even those who call themselves Christians have ever agreed on the nature of God or God's morality. What bothers me most about Sean's position isn't that he holds the views he communicates, but that he's certain he's right. As with many others, he claims his religious views grow from unassailable logic and are founded in the revealed Word of God. But moral certainty based on logic has led generations of religious people to engage in murder, war, torture, misogyny, and legions of other acts, which we now know are morally wrong. Just like those other believers, Sean is certain he's right, and he wants to convert you to his view. For my part, I'm suspicious of anyone who claims to know God's will and God's morality. Many religious figures of far more gravity than Sean McDowell have made such assertions. John Calvin exercised God's morality and burned Michael Servetus to death for the sin of owning a Catholic Bible. Martin Luther espoused God's morality when he told the Protestant princes to rid themselves of the Jews. John Knox, the Presbyterian, claimed God's morality to justify calling women the weaker vessels. I could go on, but you get the idea. Every generation has interpreted God's morality differently. Sean may understand God's intent better than Luther, Calvin, or Knox, but I doubt it. That's the key to my position. I doubt. I apply what Sean would call my God-given reason, and I conclude that I should doubt that Sean's own humble mind understands God's will and word better than the giants of the Christian faith. In his article, Why America Needs Religion, Sean wrote, "What is wrong with America? The social and moral problems facing America are legion," he said. "The increasing rates of violent crime, alcohol abuse, corporate scandals, sexual promiscuity, fatherlessness are destroying the very fabric of our nation. The separation of moral values from God," he said, "has created a society much like the period of Judges, where everyone did what was right in his eyes." Why is religion important, Sean asked. The simple answer is that secularization cannot offer any convincing reason to be moral. Secularization, he said, creates a dangerous uncertainty about morals. If secularization creates a dangerous uncertainty, it would follow, would it not, that secular societies should be more dysfunctional than similarly religious societies? Well, that question's been answered. The Kripke Center at Creighton University, a religious institution, publishes a journal, the Journal of Religion and Society. In a 2005 article by Gregory S. Paul, they measured the relationship between antisocial behavior and belief in God and attendance at religious services. And it turns out the data shows that Sean's view is exactly backwards. those societies that have the most regular church attendance and the widest belief in God are the most dysfunctional, not the least. And the converse is also true. The secular societies turn out to have the least crime, the least what we might call immoral behavior. That seems to me to allow me to reach the conclusion that God has reached his own false conclusion. He reasons that if the Christian God is necessary for morality, it must follow that belief should correlate with positive social behavior, and yet it does not. In an article titled "The True Meaning of Morality," Sean argued either morality comes from God, as he argued here tonight, or it is an inexplicable illusion with no meaning. Of these two options, it is totally rational, he said, to accept the idea that God is the absolute for morality and that he wired us with this moral sense in order to keep our natural urges from leading us to disaster. Sean's view is not totally rational. In fact, his statement presents a false dichotomy, a false choice, one of the most commonly used logical fallacies. He may know that there are other explanations for the origin of morality, and he may be ignoring them. Or he's ignorant of other possibilities. It could be also that he simply rejects any view other than his. I don't know. It could also be that he's right, but I doubt it. It strikes me as intellectually arrogant for Sean to think that his logic is unassailable and that his conclusions are perfect. In What is Right, another article, Sean argued that, quote, a disintegrating society with no bedrock of morality will be at the mercy of those in power who, with no true guide to right and wrong, will impose their own will on the rest. When people ignore traditional morality, says Sean, and seize power to serve their own ends, the results can be hideous. Adolf Hitler's demonic rule over the German people is a sobering example. Actually, what this quote presents is a sobering example of Sean's lack of logical foundation to his assertions about morality. It could be that there was no bedrock foundation of morality in church-going Lutheran Germany of the 1930s and 40s, but there are many other explanations for how the German people followed Hitler. As a matter of fact, anti-Semitism in Germany had a long, long history, long before Hitler. Sean's view may be correct, but I doubt it. It strikes me as rather narrow-minded, not to mention insulting to the German nation, to consider that one possibility. Perhaps more to the point is a quote from Hitler himself, who said, "Secular schools can never be tolerated because such schools have no religious instruction." I'm sure Hitler was just as certain as Sean. In Morality from God, Sean also asked his readers, why is it right to stop and help a stranded motorist, but wrong to veer over and run them down? Sean says, we do the right thing because our moral code comes from God and reflects his loving nature. It is right to render help because such an act is the loving thing to do. That may be true, but I doubt it. I presume, for example, that Sean refers only to his view of God's morality. We know that people of faith, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, all believe they worship the one true God. That's something about humans. You know, we have all got the one true God. Several of them. His church describes the Bible as inerrant, Sean's church. Sean claims he can prove, in fact, this is what apologetics is all about, that it is factually true. And I'm sure by his logic he can do so. And he must, because if one word is proven untrue, Sean's faith is false. It may be that the dozens of people who wrote the Bible over hundreds of years in several languages were all inspired to write without error, but I doubt it. Because there has never been a time in Christian history when the mass of believers all accepted one version of that most influential book. Have Sean and his co-religionists settled the matter of biblical interpretation of morality? 100 years from now, will mankind look back at 21st century Christian apologetics as the end of the Christian debate about the Bible and morality? I doubt it. Is there another explanation for morality? I'm sure there are many. And the truth is, I'm not an expert in religion or morality. I stand before you debating a man who's written 5 books, whose father's written 100 books. I'm a high school teacher. I'm armed with the sword and buckler of reason. That's it. I doubt if there were no belief in God, the relationship between parent and child would become savage. Animals tenderly care for their young without understanding God. Why must mankind invoke God to do what animals do by instinct? Would mankind never have learned to care for the aged or the sick or the value of honesty or truth without God? Of course we would. Not because God wills it, but because it is in our rational self-interest. Humans know what animals do not, that sooner or later, survival for the individual or the tribe depends on the caring of another. Morality grows out of self-preservation, not faith. Humans learn to care for each other because, as a weak, defenseless animal without speed, without strength, without fang, without claw, cooperation and caring means survival. Humans see a universality in the human condition when they begin to see the stranger as themselves. That's the message of Jesus and Buddha and King and Gandhi and many other brilliant thinkers. There are barriers to understanding the universality of the human condition, and Sean's view of morality is one of those barriers. One holy book, a belief in one holy book, does little to tear down those barriers, but much to create fear and mistrust in those who do not believe. For example, Sean recently wrote about President Obama. His first observation about our president illustrated my point. President Obama, Sean said, "Are you a Christian or not? You have claimed to be a Christian, and I give you the benefit of the doubt. All of you here tonight should consider how you might react if, stating your faith, someone offered to give you the benefit of the doubt." In writing about the morality of homosexuality, Sean said, "Knowing the biblical truth about homosexuality is important because many people deny that God condemns homosexual behavior. Indeed, they go to great lengths to reinterpret the Bible. Although they're not successful," Sean says, "their claims sound appealing to people who don't carefully interpret the Bible." Okay. Sean says people who don't carefully interpret the Bible fail to understand why God condemned homosexual behavior and called it an immoral abomination, while homosexuals and their supporters reinterpret the Bible to justify their behavior. Aren't both sides interpreting the Bible? Sean's church claims the Bible is inerrant, but here Sean admits that he interprets the Bible, however carefully. Why should we accept Sean's interpretation? Has God told Sean the correct interpretation? Perhaps we should just accept that God speaks through Sean. Frankly, I doubt it. In Evil and Intelligent Design, Sean McDowell wrote that, simply put, evil is when things are not as they're supposed to be, or are the way they're not supposed to be. Again, evidently, Sean knows the way things are supposed to be. He's not the first religious person to make that claim, but history tells us to beware of those who know what is supposed to be and act on that knowledge. When I finished working on this effort, I remembered a prayer that my grandfather, born into the murderous sectarian violence of Northern Ireland, said every day. "Lord," he said, "save me from those pious people who know your will." His prayer was answered. He came to America, where the founding fathers had the good sense to recognize the danger of religious division. George Washington, the father of our country, put it best. "Religious controversies," he said, "are always productive of more acrimony and irreconcilable hatreds than those which spring from any other cause." Sean may be right, but millions doubt it. And as Washington said, his certainty is more apt to cause acrimony and irreconcilable hatred than happiness. The theme of my position today has been doubt, which is really just another way of saying trust your own mind. No matter how much you respect someone, the key to understanding is a willingness to question authority. I think Christian scripture supports that view. Matthew 24:24 says, "For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect." We should be careful and put our sword and buckler of reason on so that we will not be misled. Thank you.
Before we move on to the next segment, we'd like you to take the questions you've written down and pass them to the outside of your row, this side and the far side, by both walls. Pass them along. I hope you came up with some good ones. And by the way, in case you were thinking that, wow, I skipped the Olympics tonight, don't forget, all they do is events like icicle licking until about 11:30, and then they show the actual good stuff. So you're not missing anything, and in my view, this beats it anyway. So we'll give 1 or 2 moments for you to pass those questions in, and then we'll get to the round of rebuttals. Pass them on to the side. All right, let's move forward. If you're still working on a question, you go ahead. Maybe we'll call for some more cards in just a few minutes. But let's get right back into the rebuttals. So everybody have a seat, quiet down, and we will move to Sean McDowell for his first 7-minute response. Sean.
Now, Jim would like to play it off like he gets kind of a free pass, that I'm the expert and he's the novice here. Let me remind you of a few facts that might put this into perspective. Jim has his PhD. I'm beginning my PhD next week. Jim has been teaching for 37 years on the high school, junior college, and collegiate level. That's longer than I've been alive. Look, I'm 33 years old. Jim is, how old are you, Jim?
63.
63. Look, the debate is not about Jim and it's not about me. The question is God the best explanation for moral values? Jim has chosen to defend a side that says they're not. I believe God himself is the best explanation of moral values. Now, Jim brought up a bunch of issues, but friends, these issues are red herrings. Many of you know a red herring is a fish that is dragged across a trail of a hunter to try to get him off the chase of the real issue. The topic tonight is not about the Bible. You'll notice my introductory speech. I didn't mention Jesus once. I didn't quote from the Bible. So even if I was wrong about all my biblical perspectives, in no way would that undermine my case tonight. So look at the title. It says, is God the best explanation for moral values? This isn't about religious behavior. This is not about belief in God. This is not about the Christian God. In fact, when we were sitting down at coffee, I offered to Jim, I said, well, let's debate the existence of the Christian God. He said, no. I said, let's debate whether the Bible is reliable or not. He said, no. And then he agreed on this topic. So it's a little bit curious to me that now when we've agreed on something else, he's bringing in issues that don't even relate to the particular topic. Then he said, he quoted me as if I said, without belief in God, people would be savage. Quite the contrary. I conceded in my opening, not conceded, I assumed in my opening speech that it's not about belief in God that makes somebody moral or immoral. This is a question about what best explains moral values. Do they come from God or do they come from another source? Now, you'll notice in my opening speech, I said I'm going to defend two contentions. If God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. Now, by the way, I'm not certain about this. I don't claim to have it all figured out. I have plenty of doubts. I have lots of questions. I'm on a jury myself. I still have things I don't understand. I'm trying to follow Jim's own advice, which is to follow and believe in what is most reasonable. I could be mistaken. I fully concede that. But I haven't found a better explanation for moral values. Now, Jim talks a lot about the bad things done in the name of religion, such as Calvin or religious wars. Look, I already said that bad things have been done in the name of religion. There's no debate here. But if Christians and other religious people get the blame for all the bad things done in their name, then shouldn't atheists or non-religious people get the blame for stuff that's been done in their name? Now, if you want to compare numbers, there is no debate. In terms of total bloodshed, in the 20th century alone, at least 100 million people slaughtered by explicitly atheistic regimes, communist Russia, communist China, in the Khmer Rouge. Now, what does this prove? I actually agree with Walter Sinnott Armstrong, a Dartmouth professor and an outspoken atheist. He said, "The fact that a worldview is statistically associated with a desirable kind of person or action does not show that the claims of that worldview are true. Such statistics do not show that God exists or does not exist, for example." He's right. The common denominator is that people are capable of incalculable evil. Humans are capable of incalculable evil. See, this debate is about where do moral values come from. You see, the very condemnation of religious hypocrisy and the things the church has done presupposes an objective standard of morality by which to condemn these actions. But so far, Jim has offered no feasible source for where genuine, objective moral values come from. So if objective moral values exist, God must exist. So ironically, when Jim condemns religious behavior, he's assuming that there's objective moral values. Yet there can't be objective moral values unless there's a God. So Jim uses God to negate God. He can't escape him either way. From an evolutionary standpoint, though, one has to wonder why Jim even cares about religious wars. Who cares? After all, weren't they the result of the strong preying on the weak, not unlike what we see on the Nature Channel? Isn't that what evolution does? It weeds out the weak. On an evolutionary standpoint, who cares about the death of a witch any more than the death of a mouse at the hands of an eagle? It's only if humans have intrinsic value and there is a law above the law that we can condemn such actions as immoral. Yet that only makes sense if God exists. Now, my second contention was, if God exists, we do have a solid foundation for moral values. And by the way, Jim brought up the issue of homosexuality. Once again, this debate is not about particular ethical issues. Abortion, the environment, war, homosexuality. This is about morality itself. Condemning my views of morality assumes some objective standard. Now, I don't know about you. He accused me of being very confident and assertive. He sounds like a pretty confident, dogmatic person to me. I'm not sure if I just missed that. We both have confident beliefs. The question is which is most reasonable. Now, I gave 3 criteria. I said it must have a transcendent standard. Now, what's interesting is listen to Jeffrey Dahmer, many of us know, who embraced naturalistic evolution. The sexual predator and cannibal placed the blame for his murders on his atheistic beliefs and the theory of evolution. Given naturalism, he found no basis for affirming intrinsic human dignity. His father, Lionel Dahmer, expressed Jeffrey's rationale. He said, if it all happens naturalistically, what's the need for God? Can't I set my own rules? Who owns me? I own myself. Now, I'm not saying people who believe in evolution or atheists are more likely to do that. But I want to know, if there is no God, on what basis can we condemn such actions as wrong? Now, second, I said, any moral standard must account for free will. Look, Michael Shermer, in his book, The Science of Good and Evil, lists 6 explanations for free will, and he admits that there is not one. He said, apart from God, there can't be any free will, and he simply concludes that it's just a random fact of nature. Third, any adequate system must account for human value. What makes humans special? Why should we care about mistreatment of humans unless they have dignity and value and worth? And I don't see how they can have value and worth unless they're made in the image of God. So is God the best explanation for moral values? When we clear the red herrings out of the way, I think we can see that the answer to that question is still a resounding yes. Thank you.
Dr. Jim Corbett, 7-minute response.
Well, I don't think I've ever heard myself so twisted so thoroughly in my life. There's a logical fallacy that I think most people are aware of, calling, well, a couple of them actually, but begging the question and the straw man is what was going on here. Sean wanted me to be condemning him for his views on homosexuality or these other what he called red herrings that I dragged across the trail of reason. Nothing really could be further from the truth. What I said is that the notion of this transcendent reason for morality he talks about may or may not be there. I don't know. I doubt it. But one of the things I do know is when we have people like Sean interpreting that transcendent morality for us, he's doing it from the position of claiming to speak or claiming to know God's will. That authority that he uses throughout the history of mankind has been used to do the most unimaginable evils that can be conceived. And it's the authority, it's the claim of authority that I object to. The doubt that I have is that he and his friends know more than the rest of us might be able to discern through application of our reason. I'll go further than that. He's a Christian, and many of the people here today are Christians. And I've read the Bible. In fact, I might even call myself a red-letter Christian, if some of you know what that is. One of the things about the Bible that I think everyone really ought to pay attention to is how Jesus answered questions of morality. He answered them with parables. He never gave an answer that was yes or no. He gave a story because he respected the reason of the people that he was talking to. He wanted them to use their own minds to come to the correct conclusions. He did not argue from the authority of his Father. He did not say, believe me because this is the correct way. He said, apply your reason, listen to the story, come to the right conclusion. Thank you.
Just want to make sure the organizers got enough questions. Do you need more questions, Dan and Carla? You're good? All right. Then let's move right into the 5-minute rebuttals, starting with Sean McDowell.
As you'll recall, in my opening speech, I said that tonight I'm going to defend two contentions. If God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. Now, I would like to invite Jim again before the night is up to offer his foundation for moral values. I don't have anything to respond to here in my contention because he's refused to address it. Now, he does stand up here and condemn Christians or people who have misinterpreted the Bible. He stands up here and powerfully speaks out against it. He thinks things that are wrong. What I want to know is what basis is he speaking from? From what moral basis does he make these condemnations? Now, I was a little bit surprised. I didn't quite expect Jim to quote Jesus tonight. We might have more in common than we thought. This is great. We'll have to get some coffee afterwards and talk a little bit about Jesus. That sounds like a lot of fun. Now, he said, I interpret from the position of claiming to know God's will, and it's been used to do unimaginable evils. You know what? I'm not going to deny that people have claimed to know God's will and have done unimaginable evil. That's true. People have used religion for their selfish gain. But clearly when they do that, they're perverting that religion. It's because people are wicked and evil and capable of bad things that we've all seemed to agree about tonight, that they will pervert a religion. It's not the religion's fault. It's the people's fault by doing that. Now, Jim has talked a lot about the terrible things religion has done. I want to quote again Walter Sinnott Armstrong. He's an atheist professor from Dartmouth. He wrote this. He said, none of these wars, he's talking about wars done in the name of religion, is exclusively religious. They always involve political, economic, and ethnic disputes as well. This makes it hard to specify how much role, if any, religion itself had in causing any particular war. Defenders of religion argue that religious language is misused to justify what warmongers wanted to do independently of religion. This hypothesis might seem implausible to some, but it is hard to refute, partly because we do not have enough data points and there is so much variation among the wars. I think Walter Sinnott Armstrong is right. Yes, evil people have used religion, but they've used it and have perverted those beautiful religions. Now, my second contention was, if God exists, we have a solid foundation for moral values. Now, he quoted me as saying, without God, morality is illusion. Look, it's not just me. E.O. Wilson, a Harvard biologist, as well as, he has a co-writer on with his book as well, he says specifically, if evolution is true and there is no God, then morality is an illusion. So it's not just me saying this. Both sides seem to agree on this point. Now, I gave 3 points, and I'm going to refer to them, even though Jim has not responded to my points. Second, I said, there must be some transcendent standard outside of human nature. Look, atheist Richard Taylor says this. He says the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. The modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong. Not noticing that, in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for right and wrong as well. Jim seems to appeal to this right and wrong that exists, but we haven't seen any basis for where this comes from. Now, second, I said, any adequate moral system must account for free will. Philosopher Thomas Nagel, an atheist, said, there seems no room for agency in a world of neural impulses, chemical reactions, and bone and muscle movements. Even if we add sensations, perceptions, and feelings, we don't get action or doing. There is only what happens. So where possibly can free will come from in a world of purely physical matter? Without explaining that, then Jim's condemnation of religion is actually begging the question, the very criticism he applied against me, he's the one begging the question about morality because he hasn't given a justification for morality yet. Third, human value. Look, the UN Declaration of Human Rights says that all human beings have inherent dignity. But when asked what this is based on, French philosopher Jacques Maritain said, provided we agree on these rights, provided we are not asked why. With the why, the dispute begins. The truths which I have just recalled were not discovered and formulated by moral philosophy. They spring from a higher source. So my 2 contentions so far tonight have remained unrefuted. The best explanation for moral values is, in fact, God. Thank you.
Five minutes, Jim Corbett.
Okay. I find it interesting that he had managed to put together a PowerPoint presentation responding to what I had to say before I said it. That's fairly remarkable and perhaps divinely inspired.
Thank you.
One thing I want to make clear here is that he can say as often as he likes that I have not offered a rational explanation for the source of morality, but I did. If you wish, I'll read it again. I said, I doubt that if there were no belief in God, the relationship between parent and child would become savage. Animals, I said, tenderly care for their young without understanding God. Why must mankind invoke God to explain what animals do by instinct? Would mankind never have learned to care for the aged, the sick, the value of honesty or truth without God? Of course we would, not because God wills it, but because it is in our rational self-interest. I went on to explain that the universality of the human condition is such that we have to learn to care for one another. So I have addressed the source. On religion and war and his claim that I'm somehow blaming religion for all these things, I'm not. I'm blaming the notion of authority. Mankind, and it's mostly been men, never do horrible things so willingly and happily, except when some expert in God tells them it is God's will. That's the truth. We can look at the burning of witches, we can look at the religious wars. It's not religion that caused them. It's people who claim to certainly know what God wants. Those are the people I think we should mistrust. Thank you.
Sean, you can begin your 8 minutes now.
Am I up? All right. Jim, a couple questions for you. Do you believe we should be compassionate for the sake of being compassionate?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you think we should be kind for the sake of kindness?
Yes.
Okay. I'm curious, you said when it comes to moral values that we should act in self-interest. Now, in 1 minute you said we should do kindness for the sake of kindness. Now you're saying it's self-interest, which seems to not be what morality is really about. In fact, isn't morality about not seeking our self-interest in the best of other people?
You have made, again, a logical error there in understanding what I had to say. What I said is that the origin of our kindness towards others and our conception of the universality of the human condition, that's where that's where kindness comes from. I still think it is good to be kind. I still think it's a positive value. If we were not, how long would humans live on this earth? As I said in my original disputation, how long would we live as weak, slow animals without fang or claw or any reasonable defense? We had to learn kindness. And now it has become a value that we all understand, that collectively the human community is served best when we follow the dictum that we should treat others as we would have them treat us.
Now, I agree with you. We should treat others the way that they want us to be treated.
Can I interrupt 1 second, Sean?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that. They can't see you in the back. Would you gentlemen mind standing up
Sure.
to do your
No, that's great.
cross-examination? Thanks so much.
Interesting way to do it.
Sorry about that.
All right, no worries. No, I agree we should treat others the way that we want to be treated. But once again, that presumes human value and it presumes some objective standard morality. My question is where those come from. Will you address that in your final speech?
Well, I keep addressing it and you keep not getting it. So
haven't
I don't
explained
know
where-
what else I have to say. You know, I've said several times that human beings had to learn to care for. Let me give you an example. The great white is a killing machine. And yet, the great white does not kill its mate after it mates because the species would not continue. So we are a little lower on the food chain, at least in a primitive sense, and we have had to learn to develop collective rules to ensure that our species continues. And those rules are the origin of what we call morality. And when people step outside that morality, they are doing things, as with Hitler, as with the religious wars, as with misogyny and all of the other horrors that we've talked about. They're doing things that if we allowed them to expand, would end our species.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I went on a safari last year and lions will sometimes eat their young. We see black widow mates eating others. So we see lots of things in nature in which can continue without individual, as a whole we can survive. I mean, so I don't know that that fits and explains it. Well, I got another question for you. You can come back during yours in a minute. Do you believe human beings have free will?
Yes.
Okay. In his book, The Science of Good and Evil, skeptic Michael Shermer said, if we do not have complete free will in our actions, how can we be held morally accountable? Do you agree with that, that being held morally accountable requires free will?
I think so. I haven't given it a great deal of thought as a teacher of European history, but sure.
Okay. How in a Darwinian natural process does free will emerge? I mean, in the physical process of random mutations of genes, how can a human being evolve this capacity for reason?
Well, the animal that learns to care for the other animals is more likely to survive.
Well, I agree once they learn. The question is, how do they learn that? How does that even happen in a physical, deterministic, evolutionary process? Does free will and reason even arise? That's the question.
Okay, the ones that produce living offspring and care for them transmit their genetic material to the next generation, which then is more likely to engage in the similar behavior. The ones that kill their mates are likely to go extinct.
Yeah, I agree. That makes sense. But it doesn't answer the question of how free will emerges. How do you get this sense of rationality? You've talked a lot about reason, but where does reason even come from if there's no God? I mean, evolution is a physicalistic, deterministic, irrational process. And you're saying that human beings have this capacity for thought and for reason. Now, you accused me earlier of begging the question, but now you're just saying, oh, it just happened by evolution, but I'm asking you, how can it happen? Because without it, you said, we can't have accountability, so it seems like the whole moral system would collapse without free will, and yet you haven't offered an explanation of how molecules in motion can create free will.
Well, okay, we can agree to disagree. I believe I have, and you believe I haven't.
Okay.
Let me respond to something else you said a moment ago.
Okay, hold on. You can come back to your questions. Hang on. I got one for you. In your AP European class, you said, in reference to The Prince by Machiavelli, you said, this is a humanist book. Is Machiavelli concerned with God's law? No. He's concerned with what works. Machiavelli's Prince doesn't say a good leader should be a moral man. It says a good leader should appear to be a moral man. It doesn't say that a good leader should be a believer in God. It says instead a good leader should appear to be devout. He should appear to be prudent. Honest to goodness, that is, I think, what Clinton blew it. You know, he just didn't understand that the dignity of the job is something that demands, even when it has nothing to do with how you're actually functioning in the job. You have to look like you're doing what people want you to do. Now, why not? The race society could survive and continue on if people just faked it and went through the motions. So why actually be moral instead of just appear to be moral?
Well, in that particular case, again, you're kind of raising a question on one issue that illustrates another issue entirely. That happens to be a book on political science, in which Machiavelli, the author, argued that a good prince was amoral, and that was his position. Was that if whatever that the ethic, and in fact this may very well prove my point, that the ethic was what was good for the state, and so in that same sense, the survival of the state becomes the overweening ethic. Now, I don't happen to agree with that. For example, you know, most recently we've had a lot of talk about whether or not torture was acceptable. We had John Yoo recently recordings of him saying that as far as he's concerned, if the president ordered it, you could crush the testicles of a child in front of a parent to get them to talk. And he argues that that's okay if it's for the survival of the United States. And I understand his ethic, and I understand Machiavelli, but I disagree with both of them. I would say survival is what? A state has an obligation to be something more. A state is not a rock.
Where does that obligation come from?
And here I'm quoting actually the judge.
Above the state by which to judge it. A law above the law.
That ends this segment. There'll be plenty of time for back and forth when it is Jim Corbett. 8 minutes. You're on.
All right. A very famous study that was done by Philip Zimbardo, and another one done by a professor named Milgren at Yale University, illustrate my point, I think, pretty well. In Zimbardo's study, very famous study at Stanford, they took randomly selected undergraduates. They divided them into two groups. One group was made prisoners. The other group was made prison guards. They ended up having to stop the study because when they gave those students who became prison guards, it was done in the basement of the psychology building, and they had actually set up a full prison down there. When they gave that authority to the kids who were labeled prison guards, not unsophisticated people who were poorly educated, but Stanford University undergraduates. They became brutal towards their classmates because they abused the authority that they were given. Milgram did a similar study in which he took people and put them down in front of a console, and he told them that they were doing an experiment, and that when the man in the other room answered a question incorrectly, they were obligated to shock him. And the shocks got worse as they answered the questions incorrectly, all the way up to lethal. It was labeled lethal. And with a man in a white coat standing there, in a position of authority, 80% of these people, just like you and me, and just like the Nazis in Germany, 80% were willing to shock that person in the other room who was screaming. 80% were willing to shock him at the lethal level because they followed authority. And again, that's what I object to. He also mentioned lions.
Is this a question for me, or
he also mentioned lions.
filibustering here?
He also mentioned lions, and I wanted to respond to it, but he didn't give me a chance. It illustrated my point, not his.
Now, this is your chance to turn up the heat on Sean and really make him squirm if you want to fire some questions at him.
Thank you. He also mentioned lions, and he tried to make the point that some lions kill their young, and what's the effectiveness of that? Well, that's easy. When a new male, alpha male, takes over in a lion pride, he kills the cubs of the previous alpha male so that all the females will begin their estrus cycle and his genetics can go on. It actually illustrates my point, not his. And I'd ask you to respond to that.
I'm not sure how that supports your point, because you're saying that morality comes from nature, but when we look in nature, we see things such as cannibalism, we see activity we would describe as rape, we see activity we would describe as theft, we see all sorts of what we would describe as immoral behavior in nature, yet what makes human beings different that all of a sudden we have this moral responsibility impending upon us? Because remember, if there is no God, the same accidental, irrational process of evolution has produced all of us. And Darwin himself said, he said specifically in The Descent of Man, he said nature can give us instincts, but nature can't tell us which instinct we ought to follow over another. You might have an instinct to help somebody. You might have an instinct to harm somebody. Now, what instinct ought we follow? There must be some standard outside of nature itself to criticize that behavior. Otherwise, I think pointing to examples in nature like you are makes my point. Why shouldn't human beings act? Now, I think they shouldn't, because human beings are uniquely made in the image of God, that we're endowed with dignity and value and rights as human beings. And yes, we have a responsibility to all of creation, but we also in particular have responsibility to other human beings who are made in God's image. So that's how I would respond. I don't think in any way that's a problem for my moral system.
Let me ask the question a different way.
Okay.
Those behaviors that you describe in the animals, murder, rape, stealing, whatever, all of those behaviors, presumably, or the animal would be extinct, serve to ensure that the species continues. I've made the point several times that humans, unlike the animals, as a weak animal, have had to develop relationships with other humans based on an ethic that ensures our species goes on. And the best thing for that is an understanding of the universality of the human condition. And that means we care for each other. And that means we act morally towards each other, a morality that grows out of the necessity that human beings have. As human beings, as thinking animals, we recognize the value of each other in our own survival.
Now, the problem is you're referring to an evolutionary process again, and things in nature, sure, you look at lions, and that helps them survive. Rape might help human beings survive in certain instincts. Maybe a woman doesn't want to get pregnant. choose to rape her, and that will help propagate the species. That could fit within your system. Rape could be justified. Other things that you and I want to say are actually immoral could be deemed moral within that system, because you said we have come up with this morality. We're not discovering universal truths that exist outside of us. We are creating this. I shake your hand, you shake mine, let's come up with a system. And the problem with that is we're no longer talking about objective morality. Rape is wrong because our committee decided that it was wrong, and we're going to kind of get together and flourish as a species. But I don't think when I told a story about that girl who was gang raped that we go, yeah, we decided as a species that wasn't good. We look at that and we say that in itself is wrong regardless of what people believe. We don't think there's any circumstances that can make that objectively right. So I think it's making my point, the fact that you keep referring back to nature and coming up with survival.
Okay.
All right. We're at a bypass. I think you got one more minute.
Time for one last
That's
question.
okay. I don't need the minute.
All right. Would the representatives from the various clubs who are sponsoring this come forward and hit them with some tough questions? You've been back there going through all of the questions, sorting out the stupid ones, right? We've discovered there are dumb questions. And this is your microphone. Anybody know how to turn it on? Dan, are you there? The way this works, the question will be asked, and the person to whom it is addressed will have 2 minutes, and the opponent will have 1 minute to give a rebuttal if that time is needed. So if we have one addressed for a particular debater, great. If it's a toss-up, we'll give them both a minute or two to try their hand at the question.
Okay, our first question is for both of them, and here it is. We have both individual and civic morality. Do you make any distinction between the best basis for individual morality and the best basis for civic morality on which laws are based?
I'm not 100% sure exactly what this question is getting at, to be honest with you. I think we do have civic morality, and I think we have individual morality. The same moral law. Are we supposed to stand up so they can see us?
Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
Would that help?
Sorry about that.
I think we do have civic moral values, and I think we have individual values. Now, I don't think values are relative, like you can have a value for you that would not apply to me. I think there's objective moral values that all people have that make a society function. So, yeah, I'm not sure what else they're getting at specifically in that question.
Jim Corbett?
No.
Okay. Another question.
All right. Hello? Okay. This one's for Sean. Are morals something God instills in us before we are born, or are they slowly revealed to us through our lives?
Great question. This is a question about how we learn morality. How do we know right and wrong? Now remember, I conceded at the beginning that people who do not even believe in God can know right from wrong. I think it's a part of the human equipment wired in us by God to recognize right and to recognize wrong. Now, certainly our environment and our relationships will shape how we learn this or not, but the amazing thing is universally across cultures, we find this common sense of objective morality. And this is what C.S. Lewis talked about in The Abolition of Man. He said there's common beliefs in justice, common beliefs in mercy, common beliefs in sacrificing for other people's lives. Now, what best explains the fact that morality is universal? Now, the practice of the morality might vary, but there's universal principles that seem to transcend the culture. I think the best explanation is that it's instilled inside human beings and that God can account for that. Because if there are moral laws, the best explanation is kind of a moral law giver. Now, the only other explanation would be some type of evolutionary explanation for morality. Now, the problem with some evolutionary explanation for morality is that, as most evolutionists will admit, then morality itself is a figment of our imagination. It's something fobbed on us by our genes simply to get us to cooperate. So I think, yes, part of being human, which distinguishes us from the animals, is that we naturally have a sense of right and wrong, which is a part of who we are as a species.
Response?
Did Jeffrey Dahmer naturally have a sense of right and wrong?
He probably did. Yeah, that's why he hid it from people for a
Hitler?
long time. Sure, Hitler believed.
Stalin?
I mean, it was one. Yeah, absolutely, they had it. Now, by knowing right and wrong, that doesn't mean people follow it. I'm not saying people follow it just because they know right and wrong. We don't follow it all the time.
All right. Let me just point out to you that Stalin, for example, as with Hitler, both of them were badly abused as children. They learned immorality from the situation of their growing up that resulted in them having none of the milk of human kindness. Stalin was beaten unconscious, stayed unconscious for several days by his father. Hitler hated his father, had serious issues with his grandmother, who may have been impregnated by a Jewish doctor that she worked for. It's the condition of the way these people were raised, the notion that there was some transcendent morality that they would have grown up with is belied by the fact that the environmental condition produced the horrors that these people represented.
Next question.
All right, this question is for Dr. Corbett. In a Darwinian world, why is morality relevant?
Well, I think I've answered that question. I mean, it's relevant because we are thinking animals, and we are animals that recognize, I mean, look at us. My God, let a couple of lions loose in here, none of us would get out alive. I mean, we better learn to cooperate. And that's the basis of our morality. The basis is that humans need to learn to care for one another. It's really just that simple. And those who don't are antisocial. The Jeffrey Dahmers of the world are people that haven't learned that lesson. And mostly they haven't learned that lesson because of the way they grew up, because of some abuse as a child, because of some environmental factor that intervened and prevented them from understanding that we all share a universality of the human condition. And there are a lot of barriers to that. You know, there is religion, and there's ethnicity, and there's skin color. And to the extent that we can learn about that universality and set aside those differences, we become more moral. To the extent that we accept people who have a different sexual orientation, or come from another country, or speak with an accent, we begin to understand more of the universality of the human condition, and we become more moral people because we treat each other the way we would like to be treated. And Jesus wasn't the only great man who's had that to say. Buddha said it, Confucius said it, Lao Tzu said it, they all said it.
Sean McDowell, 1 minute response.
Go to the next question.
Next
Yeah, I don't
question.
have a-
All
You know,
right,
I will respond to that. I take that back. I do have some thoughts, come to think of it. I am a little bit confused because during the cross-examination, I asked Jim if he believes in free will. And his response was, yes. And now he's saying Stalin and Hitler did not have free will. They were products of their environment. So I think he's contradicted himself here by saying, yes, we have free will, and then now we don't have free will. Look, my dad was abused growing up. My dad was sexually abused. His father was an alcoholic. He came from a horrible background. His life wasn't determined by his background, although it was tough. And I thank God I grew up in a different family than that. We do have free choices, and we are held accountable for our moral choices that we make. But what we haven't seen tonight is how any system apart from God can even give human beings this capacity for free will.
Next question.
All right, this one's for Sean. Is it objectively wrong to condemn good people to an eternity of pain and suffering in hell?
The question of hell is an interesting one. And I'll make a couple comments. Number one, tonight's debate is not about Christian theology. I could take the position of John Stott who says that people are snuffed out and cease to exist at the end, and that would in no way undermine anything that I've made tonight. He's a biblical scholar. Now, whether I agree with that or not is irrelevant. When we condemn hell, notice what we're doing. We're using some standard of justice to say that God should not act in that way. Now, I want to know, where's this sense of cosmic justice if there is no God? Where is a sense of cosmic justice if God doesn't even exist? And second, we don't complain about bacteria being sent to hell, right, or mud being sent to hell. I still want to know what makes humans intrinsically valuable that they're not the type of things that should be sent to hell. So this question actually presumes some of the very things that we're debating tonight, which is, where do moral values come from? Now, personally speaking, I don't think God sends anybody to hell. I think God has given us free choice, and he's allowed us to decide if we want to follow him or if we don't want to follow him. He has given us free will to choose if we want to be with God or if we don't want to. It's up to us.
1 minute response.
I want to respond first to this notion of free will as it related to Hitler and Stalin. I'm thankful your father was able to overcome his upbringing. The fact that other people were not does not dispute the fact that on some people the result is pretty negative. That's what's called anecdotal evidence, and it really has no place in logic. The truth is here that the notion of a common objective reality is belied by the fact that so many societies throughout history have not had the kind of objective morality that we do today. We have evolved. The Aztecs, the Mayans murdered children at their religious sites. The Druids put them in huge wicker images of mankind and burned people to death. We have moved beyond that. We haven't moved beyond that because somehow God today is more in our lives than he was then. We've moved beyond that because the human condition evolves. Go ahead.
Thank you. Another question.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Corbett. And it says, Dr. Corbett, you decry the certainty you see in Sean's position, but you seem to be certain that we should hold a position of doubt. Aren't you just as certain about your views?
No, I could be wrong.
One minute and 50 seconds left.
Don't know what to say. I'll tell you what, I got a quote here. I'll use this quote. It seems like an appropriate point. The man is James McClendon. He was a professor emeritus at the Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, a man for whom I have some respect. He said, even one's most cherished and tenaciously held convictions might be false and are in principle always subject to rejection, reformulation, improvement, and reformation. I agree with him.
Sean, 1 minute response.
I think that is a pretty interesting question. The point that he's trying to criticize me for being so certain about his views, and yet he's illustrating doubt. When we were having dinner on Monday night, he said there's a difference between me and him, that I want to proselytize, but he just wants to emphasize doubt. I disagree. I think Jim wants you to doubt your beliefs about God, grounding morality, and Jim wants you to doubt your conservative political views. Now, I'm on the other side. I'd like you to doubt your secular views or your atheistic views. So we're both proselytizing, use a word I don't like, because we believe our positions are correct. I'm not certain. I could be wrong. He says he's not certain. He could be wrong. But this idea that he kind of gets a free pass as he's just preaching doubt and I'm the one who's certain, I think is just simply mistaken.
Question for Sean McDowell.
Oh. Any chance I could respond to that?
Sure, take 1 minute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, look, I think you should doubt your political and your religious convictions, and I don't care if you're a liberal, and I don't care if you're a conservative, and I don't care if you're a believer or an unbeliever. You should doubt, always doubt. It's what being a rational human being is all about. I just didn't like having those words put in my mouth. Go ahead.
Question.
All right, this question is for Sean. Many animals show morality. For example, dolphins and others will cast out from their groups any individual who kills in vain. It seems that one must either assume animals act morally because it is beneficial to their reproductive fitness, their evolutionary success, or animals possess religion. What about morality in non-human animals?
Pretty creatively worded. You know, as we look at animals, do we see behavior such as cooperative behavior, or sacrificial behavior, or protective behavior? Yes, we do. But morality is not just behavior. Morality is about intent and purpose for why we do what we do. There is no evidence that within the natural world, dolphins act out of a self-sacrificial moral intent. Animals act based upon instinct, based upon their genes. So I think what we're doing is we're importing human characteristics onto animals, kind of like we do in Disney shows, right? We take animals and we give them certain characteristics and make them lovable, and we import human characteristics onto them. But I don't think we see within animals any type of natural ethic and sacrifice on what we do within human beings. I think morality is a distinctly human notion. We certainly don't see the type of morality that we would see in such as helping, I just forgot his name, I'm a Bible teacher, the guy on the way to Jericho, the Good Samaritan. I'm sorry. Who told that story? No, I know it's Jesus, I'm just kidding. The Good Samaritan, where you sacrifice, think about this. I just lost the whole point. The Good Samaritan sacrifices for an enemy in need. Do we see that in the animal world? I submit that we don't have the type of behavior in animals that we do in human beings. So the question still remains, how is it through this evolutionary process that humans even adapt the ability for morality? I mean, evolution is a physical process. How do you get non-physical things such as moral value from a physical process? And like I said, atoms don't have ethics. How much does hate weigh? It's a total confusion in categories. I think if Darwinian evolution is true, then morality goes out the window. I'm done.
1 minute.
The reason humans are different from dolphins is that dolphins do by instinct what humans perhaps started doing by instinct, but over time, because we are rational animals, we learned and we articulated the values inherent in that kind of self-sacrificing behavior. That's where our morality comes from, in our ability to reason why these kinds of behaviors are behaviors that we ought to encourage. That's what reason's all about. That's what separates us from the animals. Our ability to see that universality and the need for the behavior to be spread so that perhaps we can all learn to get along and not act like animals and kill one another when we disagree.
Next question.
Okay, this question is for Dr. Corbett. If you reject the supernatural and therefore all things are material, how can moral principles exist? If you accept the existence of principles, doesn't materialism fall?
You're going to have to read that again.
Okay, the first part. If you reject the supernatural and therefore all things are material, how can moral principles exist?
Well, I don't know. There may be supernatural things. I doubt it, but it's possible, I suppose. So the next part of the question seems irrelevant to me.
Okay, I think the next part said, if you accept the existence of principles, doesn't materialism fall?
Materialism. I don't exactly know what that means. You mean acquisitiveness, and is that what he means? Anybody?
I think he means physicalism. The idea
physicalism. That only physical things exist.
Only physical things exist. I think there may be an argument for things other than physical things existing. I mean, Rene Descartes made the point that there were, two kinds of things, that which existed in our minds and that which existed in the concrete world. So I'm willing to accept that there are possibly things that of which I am not aware.
Sean, 1 minute reply.
Yeah, I think this is a profound question, because without God, think about the naturalistic story. There was nothing, matter popped into existence, organized itself through a physical process into life, and then human beings, and then somehow consciousness and morality evolved. But moral values are not physical things. You can't hold them in your hands. You can't weigh them. You can't throw them. It's not like you're going to say, hey, hold this love for me, right? You can't do that. You can't look in a physics book and find descriptions of moral values being physical. So I think this is a more profound problem that he lets onto. And I don't know where exactly he stands in terms of allowing it, but think about it. Moral values are non-physical things. They are very at home in a world in which mind came before matter, in which mind, a God, is the fundamental basis of reality and created us. Non-physical things like his moral value are completely at home and make sense. But I don't see how we get them or where they come from through a purely naturalistic process without God.
All right, let's squeeze in 2 more questions, and we'll move on to closing arguments. Next question.
All right, this one's for Sean. Given that advanced culture may be an evolutionary development, how do you discount that as the origin for human morality?
Wait, say it again.
Given that advanced culture may be an evolutionary development, how do you discount that as the origin for human morality?
Given that advanced culture, can you help explain this to me? I'm not fully getting it.
Just culture, human culture.
Is culture the basis of morality? Is that the question? Cultural evolution, the basis of morality? Now, I think if you want to argue for cultural evolution, you're going to end up with relative morality. That was my whole point about condemning the Holocaust, is it was legal in their culture. They thought it was right. In fact, Hitler said he was using Darwinist rhetoric all the time. So if we're left with some type of cultural evolution, how can we condemn any behavior of any other culture as actually being wrong? So I think actually if there is no God, we are left with some type of cultural evolution. Then think about it. Could we condemn what slavery did as being wrong? No, because slaves, it was legal and it was justified by that culture. So if you take some type of cultural evolution or relativism, think about who becomes the bad guys. Well, William Wilberforce, for arguing against slavery, was wrong because he was challenging the morality of his culture. Jesus was wrong for challenging the morality of his culture, because if morality is determined by a culture, there's no objective standard, then ultimately anything can go. Think about the things that have been justified by different cultures throughout the history of the world. There's been some of the things that you've referred to. There's been things such as child sacrifice. There's been things such as harming and even pedophilia with kids has been justified in some cultures. Yet we all know that is wrong because it's written on our code. I won't say our DNA is as if it's physical, but human nature, we simply know that things are right and we know that things are wrong. And I think the only way we can condemn some type of cultural evolution is if there is a standard above and beyond culture which has been violated. And that only makes sense if there is a God. Now, could I be wrong about that? Sure. But someone please give me a better explanation and I would believe it. But I can't find one.
1 minute, Jim Corbett.
Once more, Sean tried to draw a distinction here in our debate in which he wanted to talk about morality and the existence of morality, and he said I never mentioned the Bible earlier. But his church and his theology says that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. He just mentioned slavery as something that was wrong. Well, I remember a little bit about that. The children of Ham shall be reapers of wheat and hewers of stone and drawers of water. And that line from Scripture has been used to justify slavery all over the Christian world for hundreds of years. So yeah, I do have to say that I see morality at some level as situational. And I hope that we're evolving. We used to put gay people to death, for example, and justify it biblically. We used to put women to death for witchcraft and justify it biblically. We have moved beyond that. There are other societies in the world that have yet to make that move.
One last question.
To them, it's correct what they're doing. But we've evolved enough to know that it doesn't serve us all in the long run.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay, our last question is for Dr. Corbett, and it has come from the webcast. And it says, if we are simply biological organisms, just as a cockroach is a biological organism, why is it wrong to kill a human organism?
Well, if I was in court, I would say asked and answered. But, we are not cockroaches. It's really that simple. I don't know really how else to expand on that. We are the thinking animal that has, over time, developed a system for ensuring the continuation of our species. In the case of cockroaches, they have another unique approach to ensure that their species continues. They produce enormous numbers of little cockroaches that are impervious to almost anything that might be out there to kill them.
Sean, 1 minute.
Yeah, I think this explanation of rationality setting human beings apart has big problems. Why not speed like the cheetah, or size like the elephant, or age like the turtle? It seems very self-serving for somebody, especially with a PhD, to say rationality is what all of a sudden gives human beings moral value. Now what happens? Human beings have different rationality. Do we favor human beings with more rationality than others? And what about, you might say, well, it's the capacity for rationality that humans have. Well, look, humans have different capacities for rationality. Why is rationality a value-grounding principle? I don't think that's going to explain enough where objective moral values can come from. And we still haven't seen any explanation about how the materialistic process of evolution can even endow us with a sense of rationality. But if we're made in God's image, and God is a rational being, then it makes sense that human beings would have the capacity for rationality. So his biggest justification for moral values actually makes more sense if, in fact, God exists.
Thank you very much, and thank you for providing those thoughtful questions. Let's wrap this up. Let's hear from you one last time for 5 minutes each. Sean, you're up first.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this debate as much as I have. This has been really stimulating and fun. Jim, thanks for being willing to participate. Now, you remember that in tonight's debate I said I was going to defend two contentions. That if God does not exist, we do not have a solid foundation for moral values. Now, Jim has offered a subjective foundation in survival, but no objective foundation. He still hasn't said, why should I care about the survival of the species? I do, in fact, care about them, but I'm looking for some objective reason outside of that I should. There's plenty of cultures that can survive without caring about individuals within it that survive. So I don't think that can explain objective moral value. Now he says we've moved beyond morally bad things. Notice he's saying there's improvement, but you can only have moral improvement if there's an objective, transcendent standard. Yet he hasn't offered an objective, transcendent standard. So all the criticisms that Jim has used tonight to criticize religious behavior, criticize religious misbehavior, criticize Calvin, criticize me, assume some transcendent moral standard. But he hasn't offered some transcendent moral standard. So he's actually using God to negate God. Now my second principle was, if God exists, we do have a solid foundation for moral values. I said we have a transcendent moral standard outside of us. We have free will. Now here he said, well, some people like Stalin were destroyed by their background and some people were good. That's my point. To prove that there's free will, everybody wouldn't have to choose the good, but the fact that some people can choose the good like my father did shows that human beings have the capacity for free will. So he's still stuck in a contradiction, saying, I believe there's free will, but then turns around and says it's a deterministic process. Now he's right, if God doesn't exist, then everything is determined. But if God does exist, then in fact we do have free will. My third point was human value, that any adequate moral system must account for human value. Now, Jim himself said, we are insignificant. We don't even understand how insignificant we are. He points to rationality, and I listed a few problems with claiming that human morality stems from rationality. That's not enough to ground human value. Look, this question about God and morality is not just an academic question for me. I did grow up in a Christian home, and I learned about God early on. But I hit a point where I was the age of many of you here, when I was a student, where I had serious doubts. This was not an intellectual head game for me. I remember staring at the ceiling saying, God, are you there? Is there a purpose to life? Am I completely deluded what I've learned growing up? My wife and I were high school sweethearts. We grew up in a little place called Julian. And I remember we stayed up till 3 in the morning one time as we were visiting her family, and I said, I don't know what truth is. I've got to know. My dad, he talked about, he spent a lot of his life talking about God and defending God. Well, one of the toughest conversations I had is I sat down with my dad. I said, Dad, I don't know if everything you've taught me is true. And I'll never forget his response. He looked right back at me and said, son, that's great. He said, seek truth with all your heart, and I'm confident you'll find it. And that's what I've tried to do. I've read every conceivable side that I can. I could be wrong. I fully admit that I could be mistaken. But I haven't been able to find a better explanation for not only morality, but for all reality, the science, the philosophy, the history, apart from God. If there was a better one, I would believe it. Now, some of you tonight who have listened to the evidence on both sides might want to think about actually becoming a believer in God. Now, those of you who here are inquirers, you are actually welcome to a free copy of a book I wrote with my dad called More Than the Carpenter, in which we simply talk about our story. If you want to know more where I'm coming from, it's at the book table. Look, if one thing is clear tonight, moral values are inescapable. We all know that morality is real. That's why when we've all done things, whether it's hurting somebody or lying, we felt shame, we felt guilt about it. Now, talking about shame and guilt before some evolutionary process and some purposeless cosmic universe, I don't think makes any sense. But if God does exist, and he is the basis of moral values, and has put his image inside of us, and desires that we live a certain way, then it seems to make sense. Maybe we feel guilty at times because we are guilty. That's why the solution to the human dilemma is to run from God or deny that he exists, but to seek forgiveness. Thank you.
Final word from Jim Corbett, 5 minutes.
I hardly know what to say. I've got a few random thoughts here because I was really arguing more about the source of morality as it relates to the notion of authority. And of course, Sean's position is that God is that authority, and the question really has to be asked, how do we know what God's will is with regard to that authority? And I think we should remember what Blaise Pascal said, that men never do evil so cheerfully as when they do it out of religious conviction. Or Bertrand Russell, who said, you find, as you look around the world, that every single bit of progress in human feeling, every improvement in criminal law, every step towards the diminution of war, every step toward the betterment of the colored races, or every mitigation of slavery, every moral progress that there has been in the world has been consistently opposed by religion. I say quite deliberately, said Russell, that the Christian religion as organized in its churches has been and still is the principal enemy of moral progress. Now, I don't agree with him entirely, because I'm not saying that about the churches. What I'm saying is the moral certainty that they communicate to people. George Bush, for example, said God told him to invade Iraq. But there's a woman down in Texas who says God told her to kill her children. It's following that authority that we have to watch out for. Whenever morality is based on theology, whenever right is made dependent upon divine authority, the most immoral, the most unjust, infamous things can be justified and established. Morality is surrendered to the groundless arbitrariness of religion. The harm that theology does is not to create cruel impulses, but to give them the sanction of what professes to be a lofty ethic, and to confer an apparently sacred character upon practices which come down from more ignorant and barbarous times. Thank you.